Here we are in Midtown Atlanta. This is the central business district for the city of Atlanta, where most of the work and commerce gets done. Today we're going to talk about city models and the way that they apply to our modern cities. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this is Human Geography. In better understanding cities, we're going to get into the internal structure of cities today, as our topic 6.5 gets into during urban geography. So city models help us understand how people live and work in cities. We're going to look at a bunch of different city models today to look at the structure of how cities are organized. Our first one is the first that people in the modern world started studying, which is the concentric zone model. It was made by Burgess. As the new American city developed out of World War II, we started to see this ongoing process of invasion of a city and succession, where people would move in groups and then move out of a city. It was based on a separation of social groups, of separating the population out by their working class. He used concentric rings similar to the von Thunen model. So it will look familiar to those who remember the von Thunen model. This is his model. Take a second and draw this out. Pause the video if you need to in order to write down what each of the things are. You've probably heard me say the term CBD so far this unit, but it is the Central Business District. The Central Business District is the CBD. That is the area at the center of the city where a lot of the business gets done. Major businesses are housed, and we see there's shopping and commercial areas in those places. Simply the most expensive part of the city. So in his model, he says that the CBD is at the center. But around the CBD, we see factories and industry. So the working class jobs that people need to do to make the city run. He then saw that further out from that is the working class housing. So the people who work in the factories and do the minimum wage jobs worked in the housing right around the factory districts. Then outside of that is the middle class housing. They could commute using public transportation into their jobs in the central business district. And then the larger houses would be on the outside in the commuter zone. Those are the people who had their own cars and larger land and houses on the outside and would drive into the city each day for work. The concentric zone model was a more traditional view of American cities, and we're going to get into some that are better explained in modern day cities. Next is the Hoyt sector model. So the sector model is all based on routes of transportation and the way that they connect to the central business district. So there are 4 factors in the Hoyt sector model. It said that there is a high rent sector that moves from its point of origin near the central business district along a route of travel. That can be a train like the L in Chicago, or it could be a major highway. But it is an area of high rent. It says it progresses towards high ground or waterfronts. So in Charleston, they have King Street that runs from the central business district to the water, and the most expensive houses are on that. The high rent sector moves along the route of fastest transportation, so people pay to make it to work faster, and it moves towards open space. So this is the Hoyt sector model. Again, pause and try to take some time to draw this on your own. The central business district is at the middle. Factories go in wedges away from the fastest route of transportation. Working class houses are around the factory district. Middle class housing is off of the route of transportation on the outside of where working class housing is. And the most expensive housing in the city runs along that route of transportation that makes it the fastest to get in and out of work. Next, we have the multiple nuclei model. That is the Harris-Ullman multi-nuclei model. So this says that cities develop with equal intensity around various points, or multiple nuclei. Certain activities require very specialized facilities. So instead of saying there's one central business district, they are saying that you need very specialized areas of town to do activities that cluster together. And there are certain activities that repel each other. Like public parks are probably not going to be right next to factories. Certain activities can't afford to operate in high rent areas, and that sets up this city of the multi-nuclei model. So there are multiple areas that are points that things gather around. So looking at this one, we see in more modern cities, there's a central business district, again similar to Midtown in Atlanta, where a lot of the work gets done. Expensive law offices, software companies, things like that. But then we see there is a light manufacturing outside of that central business district. So none of the heavy machinery that pollute a city. That would be found further out where it says 6 in the red zone, where it's further from the high-class housing or the central business district. We see that between the two manufacturing districts, the low-class residents, and then medium-class residential is found on the outside, away from the factories of the city. We also see there are outlined business districts and then residential suburbs as they move away. And then there's also industrial suburbs near the heavy manufacturing. So this multi-nuclei model shows that things are centered around more than one, not just a single central business district. The Galactic City model is a more recent invention. So the Galactic City model came about as suburban southern cities developed with edge cities and things like that. You can imagine which one applies to cities like Atlanta and Dallas. This is the one that you may be familiar with. So the Galactic model has a commercial and economic central area, which is often called the CBD, at the center of the city. The basic concept of this type of city model is that high-rise buildings in the center city and low-rise homes, residential areas and industrial, recreational and shopping districts surround that center city. So it is not this central CBD is the end-all be-all of the city, that we have different types of things established on the outer rim of the city. Almost like it's the center, the CBD is the sun at the center of the galaxy, and everything orbits around it. So you can see the central city is in the middle. Then you have suburban residential areas in the green around. You have something like a large shopping mall at 3. We also see there's an industrial district around the border on the other side of the city, as well as office parks, service centers, an airport complex, and then different employment and shopping centers around the city. If this feels familiar, Atlanta fits this model extremely well. The Galactic City model would equate for something like 285 to run around the city, with Midtown and downtown Atlanta in there. You can picture somewhere like Buckhead being one of those internal shopping mall districts where there's lots of fancy stores, and then a secondary one like Perimeter Mall and even North Point as we get further out is the centers of this Galactic City model. We also have an airport that is outside of our inner ring of 285. We also have an airport complex that is outside of our central city, and things like the Battery or Avalon that spread the city out so that it's not all centered around the CBD. So the Galactic City model helps us understand modern cities like Dallas and Atlanta. Bid rent theory is another model that helps us understand cities. It explains that the price of rent goes down the further you get from the central business district. We can look at the curve to understand that in the middle is the most expensive of the CBD. And typically retail is the only thing that can afford to be there because they're making enough money to cover that rent. As they get further out, there are less people, and so it's cheaper for land, and manufacturing can operate in that space where they can make their money back by not paying as much rent. And then because residential areas cost less, people will live further from the center of town in order to be able to afford the land. We see this to be true in Atlanta. This is looking at the rent in 2018 of the city of Atlanta and to help understand where things are relative to downtown. So here we have Georgia Tech and downtown. Midtown is the most expensive part of town, with the Old Fourth Ward and other areas around there. And then around Piedmont Park, it continues to be expensive as you head towards Buckhead. But the further you get out from downtown, the cheaper rent gets as you get out towards the suburbs. As you go south of the Central Business District, you see development projects like the Beltline help to develop the cost of living. After we've looked at the city models that apply mostly to the North American cities, it's important to remember that around the world, those models don't always apply. That brings us to the Latin American city model. The Latin American city model, which we can see diagrammed on the right, claims that Latin American cities are built up around a core central business district, but out of that business district has a spine of elite housing. These areas are then surrounded by concentric zones of housing that decrease in quality as you move away from the city. And this is where we see things like squatter settlements develop in Latin American cities, where people are moving from rural areas to urban areas en masse for better opportunities of work. And they create these squatter settlements where they don't own the land and they start to build up. That is the area that I'm talking about if you look at the orangish color on the way outside around the industrial park. So let's look at this model in detail. We have the central business district in the middle and the market touching it where people sell things. Away from the market is the industrial park where things are made and sold in markets. Around that industrial park is the cheaper housing for working class people. And then around that is an even further zone that we talked about of squatter settlements that we see in cities like Rio de Janeiro. If we look the other direction from the central business district, there's a historic spine that runs along the city with the most expensive elite housing around. These are the fancy columned homes that exist with balconies overlooking the central spine and mall. And at the end of it, there's typically a government or religious center called the mall. There's also middle-class residential tracts going out from those, as well as gentrifying areas around the central business district. So take a second and absorb the major things that make the Latin American city model unique. Next, we have the Southeast Asian city model. So this model is based on the Southeast Asian cities that had port zones connected to their colonial imperial powers. McGee studied several cities in Southeast Asia to make this model and discovered that there are certain aspects of land use. Some things that are unique to this model are a port zone. So there are typically old colonial port zones surrounded by commercial business districts. There's also a Western commercial zone, which is tied to either European or American powers. And then there is something called the alien commercial zone that is dominated by Chinese merchants. So we have three different areas of zones of where trade happens. There's typically no formal central business district like there is in other cities. So there are hybrid sectors and zones that grow rapidly outside of that, and new industrial parks building things on the outskirts of the city. Taking a look at it, this is a generalized model of land use in areas in large Southeast Asian cities. So the port zone is the focus of all of this. That is on the water. Bangkok is a great example of a city like this. Moving out from it, we have the Western commercial zone where trade happens. And then we have alien commercial zones, which are typically Chinese traders. You also see that there are mixes of suburbs and squatter settlements as you move out. And this is also the only city model that includes a marketing gardening zone. And then on the outside are the factories. Again, pause this and really take in the things that make it unique, because on the exams, there are a lot of questions about the different types of city models. We're almost done. I realize that this is a lot of cities, so hang in there and we're going to get this done. The African city model is really unique because they have three central business districts. They have a traditional market, open air markets or narrow streets that are traditional to the people of the place. There's also a European colonial center that is shaped around where the imperial powers built their buildings when they were managing these large African cities. And then there's a modern developing central business district that exists connected to the other two. We see that on the outskirts of town, there's mining and industry, and there are townships close on the inside where people are to where they work. We also see that there's a lot of ethnic neighborhoods that reflect their original tribal identities in these cities. So let's take a look at the detail of this model. So like we said, the square in the middle is the colonial CBD. It has rectangular street networks and was designed by the imperial power. There's the traditional one that was here before colonial powers with small shops and narrow streets. And there's an informal market zone where people have open air markets and trade things. Around those we see either ethnic neighborhoods that are segregated or ethnic and mixed neighborhoods. And there are informal satellite townships similar to the squatter settlements that we see in South American cities on the outside of the factory zone. You see that there are main roads that go through all three of those. Finally, we have the European city. So the European city is unique because they are built, mostly as we talked about in our first topic this unit, around a wall that kept them inside for medieval cities. So a lot of cities, like Paris, were built with the focus of going denser inside of city walls to protect them in medieval times. London Central City is about the same size as it was in the 60s, but something called green belts were created in a lot of European cities to counteract the effects of the Industrial Revolution. They're trying to open up countryside that was once taken by factories in order to separate the towns in the main city in order to stop this expansive suburban areas that happen in the United States. So they reclaim it with urban parks or farmland. It makes it so that when you leave the city, you're out in nature quickly. This helps make the city feel more refreshing and livable. And it also gives a unique look that when you're driving out of European towns, I remember this when we were leaving Vienna in Austria, where you're in the city 1 second and then you go under a tunnel and quickly you are in green zones. So these green belts are reclamation projects that are trying to bring back green spaces around major cities in Europe. We have some projects like this in the United States that we're going to talk about in sustainable cities, but European cities have pioneered these. Just know that European cities build denser inside of city walls as opposed to sprawling out. So today we learned about the different models of cities, and I'm not going to go back through all of them, but we have to understand that there are some that reflect American city growth, and there are some that reflect different world cities. And all of those help us better understand the way people live. Understanding the ways that cities are set up are just one step in our journey to understand our world better. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this is Human Geography.